Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jayakula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are. So the word karma means action or activity, but it specifically means bound activity, as most of you know. So activity that repeats itself in time. And as we experience that as compulsion or habit or just the repeating patterns of our body, energy, and mind, our emotions, our thoughts. Sometimes we think of these as troublesome, other times we don't, depending on what culture we grow up in and what we're being told is okay and what we're being told is not okay. So it specifically means bound activity. And basically we can think of it as patterns made up of awareness and energy that have momentum in time. They're an aspect of our experience of linear time, that things repeat and have duration. And they literally have momentum. That's why it's hard to stop patterns. If they had no force, if they had no forward moving force, no momentum, we just go, okay, I'll stop doing that. No problem. But it turns out that it's a lot harder than that. And that's one of the reasons why we do sadhana every day, why we do spiritual practice every day, because we're creating a new pattern, a new samskara, that draws new momentum, creates new momentum, and eventually the other patterns peter out. Right? They lose energy because we don't put energy into them anymore. The other word that's important is kriya, and kriya means unbound or spontaneous or improvised activity. So we are trying through the force of our sadhana to move from karma to kriya, trying to move from bound, patterned, compulsive activity to spontaneous, unconditioned activity that is just freely responsive to whatever's happening and is not conditioned by patterns of body, energy, and mind. Now, we're never going to totally have that happen because even the appearance of ourselves in this body is a habit pattern. Right? That's part of our karma too. There have been practitioners who can dissolve their bodies at will. There's a famous picture of the 16th Karmapa becoming somewhat invisible. He sort of like phased in and out. But I seriously doubt that any of us are going to have that happen. So in terms of the question, which gets to the heart of how this tradition, Trika Shaivism, views reality, which is as a continuum or a cascade, an unbroken continuum or an unbroken cascade from what is more subtle and less conditioned to what is less subtle and more conditioned. Or you could say what is subtle to what is gross. So someone who has a passionate, compulsive love for one being, another person or an animal or something like that, but really dislikes everybody else or can't be with anybody else. They're too anxious or something. They only have room for one deep affectional relationship. That is on a continuum with the unconditioned love of God, you could say, but it's just very condensed, very constricted, very stepped down. But it's the same thing, more gross. And then maybe you have someone who's a little more normal, who has a bunch of people they love, but they still, everybody else, yeah, fine, they're humans. I care about them, but, really, these are my people. These like 10 people or 5 people. So that's a little less condensed, right? That's a little less constrained. It's a little more free. It has a broader scope. And then you have someone like the Dalai Lama, who has feelings of friendship and love for everybody. That's more subtle, more expansive, but it's all the same thing on a continuum, right? And then finally, there's just like that love, compassion, mercy, caring, concern, kindness that's everywhere. And that's unconditioned. So in terms of karma, the scientific world and its discoveries are at the condensed end of the spectrum. So if we think of our literal genes, right, they are condensed version of this bigger, more subtle, more expansive expression of patterning. They are almost like a symbol of that, in the same way that lesser love is a symbol of something more expansive. And what it said is that the reason why the practice works is because everything here is a condensed or less subtle aspect of something universal and enlightened. Everything here is already that. It's just that we are having a limited experience of it. So in a sense, we can just sort of walk backward, following the thread that actually starts with our own limitations. We can, one of the ways that waking up is described in this tradition is as walking backward or walking back. This is also a phrase that's used in Taoist traditions. That you're returning. And we can think of that in more general terms, like I'm returning to my real self or something like that. But it's literally that the condensed versions of those universal divine wisdom virtues contain within them the possibility of the full expression of those wisdom virtues. So we can literally walk backward following that thread from little love to medium love to big love to unconditioned love. Or we can follow a thread from a limited understanding, like a materialist, scientific, rational understanding of some epigenetics means when experiences become genetically encoded and are passed down through generations. So for instance, people whose ancestors have been in wars, right, something very strong, or people whose ancestors have done a lot of spiritual practice or been incredibly charitable, or those are also some scars that can get passed down. It's not just the trauma stuff. Right?
And it doesn't just have to be your ancestors, right? In theory, it's the mix of everything.
Right, but you are more closely related to those people. This is why, if we can really get this, that our limitations in and of themselves are aspects of that divine wisdom, and we can see that in our limitations. This is called instantly liberating appearances. So we have something that we see in another person or in ourselves, and we instantly liberate that when we recognize it as a limited expression of a more expansive wisdom virtue. When we see that everything everybody's doing is an attempt to connect in some way, that's like instantly liberating appearances. If we could do that, if we could tear ourselves away from the notion that we have problems, that we have these faults, that we have to fix, if we could move over instead to the view that we have wisdom that is under tension, that needs to be freed, and that this process is perfectly natural, that there's actually nothing wrong with us. We have no flaws. We have natural limitation. If we could move along out of what our culture has bequeathed us, there's definitely the sense that, there's something wrong.
Character defects.
Character defects.
That's what the Christian recovery programs say. Have God remove character defects.
Right. Well, God put them there. That's the thing, though. So then they're sort of like us in our culture, as we are And then we start doing some practice, but we bring along all of these assumptions and ways of relating to ourselves from our cultures. They don't just disappear. But at some point, before you are so-called enlightened, you just start being a lot easier about your foibles and fixations, because not just because you have an understanding that this is all just natural, part of a natural process, but also because you can instantly liberate these fixations and see what they're really about. That doesn't make them go away, but you see the wisdom peeking out from behind the limitation, right? And that's very, very helpful.
The hang-ups, see.
The hang-ups, yes, hang-ups. Yeah, back in the 70s, you'd hang-ups, you'd like smash plates against a wall, and yell and scream and do whatever. So this is all a relative teaching that we are made via this system of karmic restraint. That's why we take the form we have and have the personality we have. And that we're doing sadhana to unwind karma. That's a relative perspective. That means relative to our limited experience, relative to our dualistic experience. And then there's another view which is called the absolute, which means what does it look like, not from our perspective, but from the perspective of a more woke point of view. From a more woke point of view, there is no karma. There's nothing to be done. Everything is a play. Everything is being enacted by one subjectivity. So there actually is no limitation. Every limitation is an expression of the unlimitedness of the divine. So this is what we eventually realize through doing sadhana. But in the meantime, we do what we're doing. Because that's what God is doing through us. I like to call it a game of peekaboo. Peekaboo, I see you. Meaning this process of self-limitation that is also a process of self-forgetfulness. So you have forgotten who you really are. You think you're a separate self with all these problems and all these things you have to fix, and you care about what other people think of you, and et cetera, et cetera. But from the perspective of the whole subjectivity, you are that being enacted. So there actually is nothing happening. None of this is happening in the same way that you think it is. It's happening, but not the way that you think it is. So the idea is that you eventually become what's called Jivan Mukti. Jivan Mukti means, as Abhinavagupta put it very well, you become the player rather than the played. You get to play in this experience, but with the embodied understanding of what's really happening here. And things do get more playful along the way. It's not like you have to wait till some magic moment when you get your enlightenment card.
As you learn to accept yourself, you learn to like yourself.
Well, you learn to like everybody.
Well, yeah, but you can relax with yourself.
That's right. Even you can, before you lose all of your fixations, you can like yourself. You can like yourself just the way that you are, right? Without any fixing or fiddling.
Nice place to be, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Shambhavi?
Yeah.
Hey, you said something just now about having like an embodied view. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about what that means.
Sure. So view means to see directly. And the word for that is Darshan. That is different from an intellectual understanding. We could maybe have some intellectual understanding of what I just said or some other thing about spiritual traditions. Maybe we could even get so good at having an intellectual understanding that we can sort of sound like we know what we're talking about. An embodied understanding means we have actually seen the reality of the view teachings. We have experienced them for ourselves directly. And in our culture here, sometimes it's very difficult for people to understand even what it means, the difference between an intellectual understanding and a direct understanding. It's difficult sometimes to understand what it even is, the difference between intellectual understanding and seeing for yourself directly. Because we are so used to approaching things just with our minds. Seeing directly for yourself means with all your senses. It means that you're having not just an intellectual experience, but you're having a whole experience with your body, energy, and mind. You see something. Seeing is a metaphor here. You experience something. So, for instance, getting run over by a truck is not the same as reading about getting run over by a truck. You can all understand that, right? And in that case, we might prefer to only be reading about it. But when you are doing practice or whenever this might happen, you're experiencing things in a sensory, perceptual way. Just like if something were happening, you're drinking a cup of coffee, or you're making love, or you're falling off your bicycle. All of those things are embodied experiences. And it's the same with Darshan, the direct seeing of the nature of the self, the nature of reality, the nature of God. These are all the same thing. And the real key is that seeing in the way that I'm describing is the same as knowing. When you have the darshan of the living presence of reality, of God, of the self, you know the self. It is equal to knowing. And you know it in an embodied way. You can't say how you knew it, how you know it. You can't say, well, it makes sense because A, B, C, D, Q, E, D. It doesn't work that way. You couldn't explain to anyone why you know what you know. You just do. The experience itself is a getting of wisdom simultaneous. Now, obviously, that doesn't happen all at once. I'm evidence of that. It happens, however, it happens for each person. But every time you connect with that living presence, there's more wisdom that happens, more possibility of expressing wisdom virtue.